The palace gates were shaking. Flares painted the night sky red as thousands pressed against the iron barricades, chanting names that rattled through every corner of London. Diana. Justice. Kate. The crowd surged forward, their voices colliding with the sound of armored vehicles pulling into position. Inside the palace walls, chaos erupted in whispers and hurried footsteps. And then, it came. A single sheet of parchment, stamped with the royal seal, was carried out under armed guard and placed before the press. With trembling hands, the spokesperson read the words that would forever change the monarchy. Effective immediately, the Queen Consort will step back from all public and private duties. Authority shall be redirected to the Prince and Princess of Wales. In an instant, centuries of tradition cracked open like glass under pressure. Camilla's face turned ghost white. Charles gripped the edge of his chair as though the ground itself were giving way beneath him. And William and Kate stood in silence, a storm hidden behind their eyes, knowing this moment was not chance, it was war. Before we unravel the darkest night in royal history and the stunning announcement that sent shockwaves through the monarchy, make sure you subscribe to Dynasty Insights. Here, we expose the untold truths behind the palace walls and bring you the stories the world isn't ready to face. Don't miss what happens next. The announcement itself had been carefully timed, released at the stroke of midnight, when the world was least prepared and most vulnerable to shock. 4 years, palace statements had followed predictable rhythms: engagements, charities, ceremonial duties, and polite denials of scandal. But this was different. It wasn't ceremony. It was combat. This wasn't a simple resignation or a health update. It was an execution carried out in velvet gloves. The public had no warning. Only moments earlier, the palace was wrapped in eerie calm. The gates were lit softly by lanterns, the city humming with the muted sounds of late-night traffic. Then, without precedent, alerts spread across television stations and social media feeds, Buckingham Palace to deliver a midnight announcement. Speculation ignited like wildfire. Was it Charles? Was it Kate's health? Was it William stepping aside? But the truth was far darker than anything the nation expected. Inside the royal chambers, tension had built to the breaking point. Charles sat rigid in a gilded chair, his face drained of color. The king had spent his entire life preparing for stability, for continuity, for an orderly monarchy rooted in ritual. But nothing about this was orderly. Camilla paced across the room like a caged predator, her fury barely contained, demanding to know who had dared to undermine her. 4 years, she had been the immovable force of the monarchy, silencing whispers, shielding Charles, bending traditions to her will. Now, in a matter of sentences, everything she had clawed to achieve had been stripped away. And then there was William. Calm, upright, his hands clasped behind his back as though he had been waiting for this night his entire life. His silence was deafening. Every glance at his face reminded the palace staff of Diana's eyes that had once terrified the establishment because they saw through everything. Beside him, Catherine radiated a cold fire. She did not need to speak. Her mere presence was enough to tilt the room's balance. Staff members avoided her gaze, as though looking at her too long meant confessing their allegiance. Beyond the gates, the world demanded answers. Crowds swelled into the night, cell phones raised, live streams broadcasting the tension to millions across the globe. News anchors stumbled over their words, calling it a seismic shift and a thunderclap from within the House of Windsor. The announcement was only 30 words long, yet it detonated with the power of an earthquake. The Queen Consort, the woman once seen as untouchable, had been pushed into irrelevance with surgical precision. And here lay the truth. This was not an accident. The timing, the phrasing, the delivery, it bore the unmistakable signature of William and Catherine. For years they had played the long game, endure the slights, smile at the cameras, accept the quiet humiliations. But while they smiled, they planned. Every handshake, every speech, every carefully measured silence had built to this moment. When the crown finally loosened around Camilla's head, they were ready to snatch it from her. The midnight announcement wasn't just news, it was a declaration of war. The monarchy had split, and the battlefield was no longer hidden in whispers. It was alive in the streets, roaring in the chants of the people, reflected in the burning eyes of William and Kate. And for Camilla, it was only the beginning of her darkest fall. The ink of the midnight announcement was barely dry when the second blow landed. Within hours, leaks began spilling across every major network, not from journalists digging in archives, but from deep within the palace walls. Documents, letters, recordings, evidence of something festering in the monarchy's shadow for years, surfaced with surgical precision. It was no accident. Someone had chosen this moment to drive the knife straight into Camilla's side. The files revealed whispers of corruption, favoritism, and backroom manipulation. Letters traced back to Camilla's allies, exposing her attempts to sway charities, influence decisions, and sideline Catherine from critical royal duties. Hidden accounts showed money redirected to causes that raised eyebrows, connecting her inner circle to questionable dealings. And perhaps most damning of all, a secret recording surfaced, Camilla in a private exchange, dismissing Kate as a placeholder queen, and warning that the monarchy must never allow Diana's shadow to return. The clip was barely 20 seconds long, but it was enough to ignite a wildfire. By dawn, the world had heard her words. Social media erupted in fury, hashtags trended globally, hashtag justice for Diana, hashtag stand with Kate, hashtag end the consort. The betrayal wasn't just scandal, it was spectacle. The image of the monarchy itself began to split down the middle, the divide visible in every headline and every chant outside the palace. Inside, the revelation hit like a thunderclap. Camilla stormed into Charles's chambers, her voice a whip of rage. "You will not let them do this to me," she hissed, slamming a dossier of printed leaks onto the table. Charles, trembling with fatigue, could barely muster a reply. His eyes were fixed on the papers, reading each damning line as if the crown itself was unraveling before him. He knew the truth. This was no ordinary leak. It was orchestrated. It was war. And the culprits were no mystery. Across the palace, William and Catherine moved with deliberate silence, their composure sharper than any spoken accusation. They never admitted their hand in the betrayal, but the signs were unmistakable. The timing of the leak, the precision of the exposure, it had their fingerprints all over it. 4 years, they had endured Camilla's dominance, her subtle dismissals, her efforts to bury Diana's memory beneath her own reign. But now, the tide had turned. The son of Diana and his wife had struck, and they struck hard. Catherine, especially, emerged from the shadows in a way no one expected. Palace insiders whispered that the announcement was just the beginning, that she had been entrusted with something sacred. Princess Diana's private letters, sealed for decades, now passed to her daughter-in-law as a symbol of faith. One such letter, revealed in the press the same morning, seemed to foreshadow this very moment. "The crown may silence me, but it cannot silence the truth. My sons will carry it, and those who love them will defend it." The public didn't see Catherine as a victim anymore. They saw her as the embodiment of Diana's unfinished mission. The betrayal was twofold. Not only had Camilla's influence been publicly dismantled, but her greatest weapon, silence, had been stolen. For years, she had wielded control in shadows, maneuvering unseen, untouchable. Now, the shadows themselves betrayed her. Her private words were weaponized against her, her secrets laid bare, her reputation carved open for the world to feast upon. By mid-morning, newspapers declared it the fall of the consort. Analysts predicted her retreat would be permanent. For the first time, Camilla's camp looked fractured, her allies uncertain whether to defend her or abandon her sinking ship. Every moment she remained silent felt like another victory for William and Catherine. Every outburst she made only confirmed her desperation. The people had already chosen sides. Crowds outside the palace didn't chant for Charles, nor for tradition. They roared for Kate, they demanded justice for Diana, they hailed William as the rightful force to steer the monarchy forward. The betrayal wasn't just political, it was generational. Camilla had once believed she could rewrite history, bend it to erase the inconvenient ghost of Diana. But now history itself had risen to strike back. And the strike was merciless. The betrayal had been unveiled, and the battlefield was no longer hidden. The monarchy was bleeding in the open, and the war for its soul had only just begun. The palace, usually a sanctuary of polished routines and muted protocol, became a fortress under siege from within. Guards lined the corridors, advisors whispered furiously in shadowed alcoves, and doors slammed hard enough to rattle portraits of kings long dead. The betrayal unveiled in the morning papers had not just embarrassed the monarchy, it had detonated it. And at the epicenter of the blast stood Queen Camilla. She stormed through the halls like a storm unchained, her voice slicing through the silence. "Who did this?" she roared at trembling staff, her fury echoing off marble walls. Servants who had once bowed in fear now avoided her gaze, unwilling to be dragged into her wrath. Some quietly shifted their loyalties, others whispered Catherine's name like it was a shield. Camilla knew it, felt it, tasted the betrayal in the air. Her grip was slipping, and every corridor betrayed her. In the king's private chamber, the confrontation reached its peak. Charles sat hunched, shoulders sagging under the crushing weight of the crown. His hands shook as he pressed them against the table, the leaked documents spread before him like a battlefield map. "This is the end of us," he muttered, his voice hollow. Camilla leaned in, her eyes blazing. "No, it is the end of me. And I will not let them destroy what I have built." Her words were venom, her fists clenched. "You will speak. You will condemn this treachery. You will silence them before it is too late." But the king said nothing. His silence was more damning than words. For the first time, he looked at her not as his queen, but as the cause of the fire now engulfing his reign. The tension exploded when William entered. He did not knock. He did not bow. He walked straight into the chamber, his presence cutting through the air like a blade. Camilla froze, her fury shifting into a colder, more dangerous rage. Charles lifted his eyes, relief flickering briefly, as though William's arrival offered a solution he dared not voice. "You planned this." Camilla spat, her voice trembling with rage. "You and your wife think you can tear apart this family and crown yourselves in the ashes." William didn't flinch. His eyes, sharp and unyielding, locked onto hers. "No," he said slowly, his voice steady, each syllable deliberate. "We are saving it from you." The room fell into suffocating silence. Even Charles seemed to stop breathing. The words lingered like gunpowder in the air, ready to ignite. Camilla lunged forward, her composure shattering. "How dare you? You ungrateful child. You think because you wear Diana's face that the world belongs to you? You will destroy everything." William stepped closer, the air between them crackling with unspoken violence. He didn't shout. He didn't raise his hand. His calm was more terrifying than her fury. "You destroyed it long ago," he whispered, his voice low but cutting. "We are only here to finish what you started." At that moment, Catherine entered, silent as shadow. She did not storm. She did not shout. She stood in the doorway, her figure framed by the golden light spilling from the corridor behind her. Her eyes locked on Camilla, and in them was something colder than anger, justice. Staff who witnessed it would later whisper that it was as though Diana herself had walked into the room. Camilla faltered. For all her bluster, all her rage, the sight of Catherine's unshaken calm unnerved her. Catherine did not need to speak. Her presence alone shifted the balance of power. Charles looked between them, his queen trembling with fury, his heir standing tall with his wife, the people already rallying behind them. He knew then that the monarchy's future was no longer his to command. What followed was chaos dressed in velvet. Advisors fled from one wing to another, some siding with William, others clinging desperately to Camilla's sinking throne. Guards whispered of choosing who they would protect if the palace turned violent. The air was thick with treachery, the kind that no crown could silence. By nightfall, the palace was no longer a home. It was a battlefield. And though no blood had yet been spilled, the threat of it lingered in every corner. The monarchy, once defined by silence and ceremony, had become a war zone. And at its center, William and Catherine stood, not as heirs waiting for a crown, but as generals claiming their ground. Camilla had demanded loyalty. William had offered defiance. And Charles, trapped between love and legacy, could only watch as the palace he thought he controlled slipped into the hands of the next generation. The war for the crown was no longer secret. It was alive, roaring, and about to spill beyond the gates. London was no longer just a city. It was a battlefield. By the time the sun set, the protests had swelled into an unstoppable tide. What began as chants outside Buckingham Palace had spread across the capital. Trafalgar Square, Westminster, Downing Street, each echoing with one unrelenting cry, "Justice for Diana! Power to William and Kate!" The air was thick with smoke, flares bursting against the night sky, painting the old stone facades crimson. Riot police moved in formation, shields raised, their helmets reflecting the inferno of flashbangs and burning banners. But the crowd was not cowed. Every baton swing, every order barked through megaphones, only fueled the fury. The people had waited decades to see the monarchy face reckoning, and now, with Camilla exposed and Catherine rising, they would not be silenced. Outside the gates of Buckingham, the tension reached breaking point. Barriers shook as thousands pressed forward, their fists hammering against the steel, the sound echoing like war drums. Placards waved high, some painted with Diana's smiling face, others with a single word scrawled in blood-red ink, "Enough." Inside the palace, the scene was just as volatile. Guards were on high alert, rifles locked, every entrance fortified. Advisors shouted into phones, begging for calm, but their voices drowned beneath the roar of the crowd. Charles stared out from the high windows, his face pale as the flames reflected in the glass. He had dreamed of being a king of stability, a bridge between tradition and modernity. But now he saw the truth. He was a king presiding over collapse. Camilla refused to look outside. She raged instead through the halls, barking orders to staff who no longer listened. "Clear them out. Arrest their leaders. Do something," she screamed, her voice hoarse. But the advisors only exchanged nervous glances. They knew the truth. This wasn't just a protest. It was an uprising. The monarchy had lost control of its people. William and Catherine, in contrast, moved with chilling composure. They had been warned not to show their faces at the gates, not to risk inflaming the fury further. But William understood something the advisors never could. The people weren't the enemy. They were the weapon. By standing silent, by letting their mother's ghost walk in the chants of thousands, he let the crowd speak for him. Catherine stood at his side, her eyes burning with the weight of the moment. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her very existence among them was enough to turn protest into revolution. And then came the breaking point. A group of rioters, faces covered, surged forward with ropes and chains. They hooked them onto the iron gates and began to pull, their screams rising into the night. Police charged, batons cracking against shields, but the mass of bodies was too great. The gates shook violently, sparks flying from the hinges. The symbol of the monarchy itself, the great black barrier meant to keep the people out, was seconds from falling. Inside, guards rushed to position. Rifles lifted. For a heartbeat, history teetered on the edge of bloodshed. If one bullet fired, the palace would become a war zone. Charles shouted for restraint, but his voice was drowned by the thunder outside. Camilla screamed for force, her desperation reaching a fever pitch. And William stepped forward. He stood before the king's advisors, before the guards, his voice cutting through the chaos. "No guns. Not against our people." The order stunned the room. Guards hesitated, hands still gripping their rifles, but slowly, one by one, they lowered their weapons. It was a moment that would be replayed across the world, the heir to the throne choosing his people over the palace. The gates did not fall that night. The chains snapped, the rioters pulled back, and the police held the line. But the message was carved in fire across London's sky. The monarchy was no longer untouchable. The people had risen, and they had chosen their side. For Camilla, it was humiliation beyond endurance. To see her stepson claim the loyalty of the streets while her own name was spat like poison, it was a defeat deeper than any crown could mend. For Charles, it was despair. He was not the king of stability. He was the king of collapse. And for William and Catherine, it was the beginning of something far greater than rebellion. It was ascension, not through coronation, but through the raw, uncontrollable power of the people themselves. The streets had turned. The monarchy was bleeding. And the war for its survival was no longer in palace corridors alone, it was everywhere. The dawn after the riots did not bring calm, it brought reckoning. London awoke to the scent of smoke and the echo of chants still ringing in the air. Newspapers across the world carried the same headline in different languages: the palace falls silent. For the first time in living memory, Buckingham itself looked diminished, its iron gates scarred, its stone walls stained by the fury of its people. And inside those walls, the most devastating blow yet was delivered. At precisely 9 o'clock, the palace released its second statement in less than 24 hours. It was short, stripped of the usual ceremonial flourish. Her Majesty the Queen Consort has chosen to step back permanently from all public and private royal duties. These responsibilities will now be carried by the Prince and Princess of Wales, who will represent the Crown at the highest level. The words were framed as voluntary, but everyone knew better. This was exile by velvet decree. Camilla had not stepped back, she had been forced out. Her reaction was volcanic. She shattered a glass in her hand when the statement was read to her, blood dripping onto the silk of her gown as she screamed at Charles. "How could you let them do this? How could you betray me?" But Charles had no strength left. He sat slumped, his crown suddenly heavier than his body could bear, staring blankly at the paper in his hands. His silence was his answer. He had lost the battle, and with it, the woman who had defined his reign. For William and Catherine, however, the moment was not triumph but transformation. They did not appear in celebration, nor did they give speeches to claim their victory. Instead, they emerged onto the palace balcony in silence, hand in hand. Below them, thousands of voices erupted, not in protest, but in thunderous applause. The people had chosen their king and queen long before coronation, and now the monarchy itself seemed to bend to their will. Catherine's presence was electric. Draped in black, her posture regal yet unyielding, she looked less like a princess and more like a queen forged in fire. Every camera in the world captured the way she held her head high, the way her gaze cut through the crowd like a blade. For those who still doubted her strength, that image silenced them forever. William stood at her side, his face grave, as if aware that this was not victory. It was the beginning of an entirely new war. In the shadows of the palace, Camilla slipped away. No farewell, no ceremony, no dignity. Only a handful of loyal aides escorted her as she vanished into black cars waiting at the side entrance. To her, the monarchy was theft. Her hard-won crown ripped away by a woman she had tried for years to belittle and a son who carried the face of the ghost she could never defeat. But the world had already turned the page. Analysts declared it the death of the old monarchy. Historians compared it to abdications, to revolutions, to coups. And through it all, one truth stood stark. William and Catherine had not just inherited power, they had taken it. For Charles, the tragedy was complete. He was still king in name, but no longer in spirit. His crown sat upon his head, yet his authority had shifted into the hands of his son and daughter-in-law. He was a monarch out of time, trapped in the ruins of a dream he had fought his whole life to realize. And so, the crown itself was reborn. No longer guarded by tradition, no longer ruled by silence. It was claimed by those who dared to confront truth. William and Catherine were not waiting anymore. They were leading. The announcement had said it plainly. Camilla was finished. But between the lines, the meaning was far darker. This was not just her fall. It was the end of an era, the death of a monarchy that had tried to bury its ghosts. Diana's shadow had risen, not as a haunting, but as a legacy. The people had spoken. The palace had bowed. And the crown would never be the same again. The crown has been shaken, the old order shattered, and a new fire burns within the palace walls. But what happens next could be even darker than what we've seen tonight. If you believe William and Catherine are the true heirs to Diana's legacy, hit the like button. And if you want to uncover the next secret the palace is desperate to hide, subscribe now, because this story is only just beginning.